Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the kind invitation. It gives me a great pleasure to be here in Heidelberg again, and I will try to show you some lot of maps. And as geographer, I think that we can think about a lot. So that why I'm doing the research on Europe scale-up geography. One of the reasons is this. Yeah, when you look at just the different papers in Central and Eastern Europe, oh, the Silicon Valley is not everywhere. In Poland, in Hungary, in Czech Republic, the Eastern Europe's new Silicon Valley, and so on. So Silicon Valleys are everywhere. The The most brilliant are what I have heard that when I have been to Sicily in Catania, and that is not far from Catania, the volcano Etna. And now they have a high-tech cluster called Etna Valley, which is a contradiction in term. But it is true what Henry Rowan wrote some 2 decades ago, that just to take the name is not enough. When you look at here the name Silicon Fan and Silicon Valley, more or less I think it is very well developed. But what he said, it's really true. You can't copy Silicon Valley. You could use the name. You need more. What you need is really the unique constellation of talent, venture capital, infrastructure, energy, and combining everything with everything. Yeah? Silicon Valley is not a place, it's rather a network, and it is not so easy to copy, but we use the term. Yeah? And that is one of the reasons of my research. Okay, look at how far we are forward with the startup development in Europe. And the second is also a shift in the narrative. When you look back just in the last 3 decades and hear the frequencies of using the terms, somehow signalizing the narratives. So some 3 decades ago we had more the industrial district than the industrial cluster, as far as I know, that here we're also in this area about this discussion. And now we use the term entrepreneurial ecosystem or innovation ecosystem, which is also a little bit contradiction in terms, because one of the basic of the ecosystem are the startups. And when the startups are disruptive and the ecosystem, this is sometimes not so straightforward, the idea. But when we look just the term in what we use in geography or the so-called place-based policies, the ecosystem as a term. But on the other hand, we know not so much about the regional pattern of one of the basic of this ecosystem, the startups and the scale-up. That is why I looked at the dayroom.co, which is a very good databases for the startups. Crunchbase is the other. I prefer rather the deal room. And to make the localization, I use the OECD EU classification for Europe, the functional urban regions. And the startup is defined in that case that companies designed to grow. So that is not any arbitrary threshold, let's say the age or the number of employees or the technology. It is rather company designed for growth. And the scale-up, I define those startups which received or raised more than 1 million euro. Because the distribution of startups follow the power rule or Pareto, what do you want, all these, or the long tail, so that a relatively small minority are responsible for the majority or the overwhelming majority of the funding. And running through the search in the DROOM database, we could identify around more than 12,000 scale-ups in Europe. Just before going into detail of the European scale-up geography, because yesterday we talked, and also today, a lot about artificial intelligence and robotics. Just to show you some figure rather at global level where we are. Yeah? And maybe this shows exactly what is the problem in Europe. There are two problems. That is one, what you can see. When we see just the number of startups in artificial intelligence and how much funding they raised, around 130 billion euro. Just the sheer number in Europe and in the United States is okay. Yeah? But when you look at the funding, yeah, that's 7 times higher. Yeah? There is some problem in the scaling or the funding gap, what we can say in Europe. And I showed you this because when you look at the figure for the UK, it shows exactly what Brexit means in innovation and in startups. Yeah? Look at the figures in the UK. And I show this because we have also colleagues from Israel. You can see the figures that in that case, in artificial intelligence, these are the global player anyway. So the rest of the world is anyway nothing. So that relatively small number of regions and countries are competing for that. And maybe just one table to show that, okay, US, we can say that is a leading in artificial intelligence and in startups, but also within US, everything is concentrated in the Silicon Valley or the San Francisco Bay Area. So my research in that case is to somehow discover the scale-up ecosystem. It's based on the performance, what performance the startups have, number of scale-ups, funding, and scaling possibility, and with two very important factors. That means access to funding, how they can have access to funding on the one side, and because we have here the seminar or this meeting on knowledge, for us is more important the access to talent, which I will show you in details. Now I run a cluster analysis through these more than 12,000 scale-ups and localized in European cities or the city regions or the functional urban regions, and could identify 166 cities with considerable or significant scale-up activity according to these three most important indicators: number of scale-ups, total funding of scale-up, and number of scale-up with market value more than 200 million. This means not a unicorn, but rather a unicorn in developing status. And when you look at just this, you can see the very strong concentration. As I mentioned, the power rule is the rule in this case. And these are just on the top, what I classified as a global scale-up cities, so London, Paris, Berlin, and Stockholm. What does it mean? We will see later on with the figures. And the second tier is, in that case, the top European scale-up cities, 11. Munich is here. And you can see also the difference between Berlin and Munich. So let's look at the performance indicator. And when you just look at this map, you can see immediately and in many maps you will see the same anyway. Yeah, that just to look at the sheer number of the scale-up is concentrating very strongly in London, Paris, Berlin, Stockholm. Yeah? And also the top European cities, they concentrate around 60% of all the scale-ups in Europe. And immediately you see the difference when you see the southern and the eastern part of Europe, that Central and Eastern Europe concentrate here only around 3.5% of the scale-ups. So much about the new Silicon Valleys in Czechia, and Hungary, and Poland, and so on. Yeah? That is. And when you compare that is 440 scale-ups, is it around the scale between Dublin and Stockholm? Yeah? So that some large scale-up center in Europe has much higher values in the performance than the Central and Eastern European large cities. Making just looking at the density, in that case, the scale-ups per 100,000 inhabitants. I show you these pictures because we had yesterday the first presentation was about the blockchain and so on. So now that Crypto Valley, that is the highest value per 100,000 inhabitants, the number of scale-ups, the Crypto Valley is Zug in the Switzerland, which a little bit strange, a small city, really in a valley anyway, with 30,000 people, but at a very high concentration of blockchain and crypto companies. Also in the funding, we can see these. So looking at the funding, how much funding received the startups, we can have always the same picture. The concentration here a little bit stronger the concentration in London, Paris, and also Berlin and Stockholm. But also the top European cities have relatively high share. And just to look again, the Central and Eastern European and the Southern European cities, and you can see that in that case, the difference is much stronger. The Central and Eastern European cities concentrate only 2.5% of the total funding of startups in Europe, which, yeah, a little bit less than what the startups in Munich received. Making also here just density figures. Maybe here will be at first something what we later on discuss. That means the funding in million euro per GDP. That in England you can find two large green bubble. This is Cambridge and Oxford, and this yellow is Lausanne. So we see that how the university cities excel in that case. But unfortunately also in that case, the Central and Eastern European cities and the Southern European cities show relatively low values. So put all this together, and we are at the performance as well. Put all this together, the number of scale-up per 100,000 inhabitants, and also the total funding. You can see that university cities such as Cambridge, Lausanne, Oxford, Malmö in Sweden, which includes in that case the functional urban area, includes Lund, which is a very famous university city. That is why they have high values. And I wrote here Budapest, Bucharest, Prague, Warsaw, with really a huge difference on that. And that is what we can see in funding. Maybe the difference is more characteristic that you can see different cities, but again, Cambridge, Oxford, Lausanne, Basel, Grenoble, Malmö, Geneva, as university cities have relatively good performances. So my question was in that case that what does it mean what are the main reasons for that? Access to funding or access to talent? Or what role the access to talent can play here? So let's look at first the funding. Here you can see in the map that those venture capital companies which are headquartered in the cities. Yeah, that means it's easier access to have. And here now the differences are really brutal. Yeah, so the regional differences. So how London concentrate almost 40% of that, and just one point back to what Brexit means for innovation, for startup and startup dynamic. It means also that for the Central and Eastern European startup and the Southern European startup and many European startups, when they want to be increased and get funding, they have to go to London. Yeah? So after a while, they won't be Hungarian or Polish or German startup anymore. They should register in London, because in London there is the possibility and the financial system and the venture capital when they can get the venture capital funding to increase. But anyway, Paris, Edinburgh, Berlin is very good in that case. And these very few cities, London, Paris, Edinburgh, Berlin, and Stockholm, concentrate more than 70% of the whole venture capital which is available for the startups. And it explains in many cases why somehow in Central and Eastern Europe the number of scale-ups is relatively low, because after a while they go to London. That is also the same when we look at also normalize the figure in the case of all-time investment of the venture capital funds in Europe, and the same that in Central and Eastern Europe, all the cities, when we combined the venture capital funds all-time investment is around 4 billion, and just alone in Oxford or in Cambridge is nearly the same. So what knowledge here and a role plays, I will talk about later. So that when we look at this investment per GDP, then we will find, okay, Edinburgh, that is also a special case, as Zug was a special case in that. There is a huge fund there which invests globally and not only locally. But our main topic today is rather access to talent, how to measure the access to talent. And in the deal room, you can have relatively good data about the funder. About the funder, the age and the name, and also the data about it, that which university were attended the funder. Yeah? And that is what I was looking for, to look at the number of those funders who funded startups and were attended to the university. Yeah? So the real question is, how many funders we have who funded the startups, who studied at the University of Heidelberg? How many? Around 30, 32 anyway. Yeah? So that's, what does it mean, 32? That's, can we see in that case that certainly in that case, globally the leader is well, in Europe the leader is Paris and London. But also when we look at the university, the funders who attended to the university in Amsterdam, Berlin, Barcelona, and Stockholm is around between 500 and 700. Munich is a very well placed anyway, that the figure is 420. And these are the leading cities. You can see that in that case, also Madrid, Barcelona, Dublin, Copenhagen, and Amsterdam has relative good position. But nevertheless, they produce, the universities are able to nurture the students and encourage the students to fund the startup or create a startup. And these are the figures for the Central and Eastern European cities. In Budapest, there is exactly 65 students who studied at the universities in Budapest and later created a startup. But you can see here again that the university cities, Cambridge and Oxford, are brilliant. Also some other university cities, and I wrote here Heidelberg, that should be with 30. So looking the funder density, that means the number of funders divided by 100,000 inhabitants. the global leading cities, in that case, Berlin, Paris, London, Stockholm, because these are large cities, and we can accept that, okay, that the number of funders are very high, more than 1,000, but when we compare to the size of the city, they achieve not so good than Amsterdam, Dublin, or Copenhagen. Once again, the Central and Eastern European cities you can see here. And as I mentioned, the university cities excel once again, always excel anyway, which means that not just the sheer size is important, that the large cities certainly create more possibilities to establish a startup, but also the university cities, Cambridge with the highest figure, and Oxford, Maastricht, Lausanne, and Leuven, Leiden, Malmö, university cities with relatively high figures. And you can see in that case that the picture is a little bit more diverse when we looked at just the funding or looked at just the performance of the scale-up cities. So how can they scale? So what possibilities could give these cities to scale are measured with a figure that those funders who attended the university and were able to raise more than 10 million euros as a funding. Yeah? That's somehow a figure showing the scaling possibility. In that case, again, London and Paris is the place where they can scale. And also the university cities, Cambridge and Oxford is a good place for scaling. So the leading cities are really the good place for scaling. And that is one of the point where, okay, let's say only 65 students studied at Budapest universities, and after that funded their startups, but later on for scaling, they moved to maybe London, Paris, or Munich. So when we see the total number of scale-ups funded by students who attended to the university and were able to raise more than 10 million euro. That means every 4 on average in Europe were able to do that. That means that 27%. But in some cities, more than 40% of the students studied at the university, funded a scale-up, and were able to scale and grow. That is very important, as I showed at the very beginning. One of the problem is the scaling problem for the European startups, and also the funding gap. So in particular in Lausanne, Cambridge, Oxford, Zurich, Dublin, Paris, okay? Yeah, Berlin is unfortunately is rather not a real good place for the student when they want to scale. In Berlin there is ample funding, more or less, but somehow it is not enough for the scaling. Munich is better placed in this situation, and that is when we look at the average and also the others. So, what are the main messages of this short research, looking at the access to talent, access to capital, and the performance in Europe? So, one is, I would say the size is important. Yeah? Definitely, large cities could offer more possibilities, the number of startups, the funding of startups, and so on. But how these startups cities or scale-up cities are developing, I think we should distinguish 2 stages. One is to grow to self-sustaining. This means could sustain these. And the second is self-reinforcing system, when they will be able to attract resources. Resources are capital and talent. London is exactly in that case, and Silicon Valley certainly, everybody wants to go to Silicon Valley. But London, or the global scale-up cities in Europe, reach this stage. After a certain scale, they are able to attract capital and, most importantly, talent. Self-sustaining systems are when they are able to sustain the whole system, so there is always some upstream of students and capital available to. So the question for the top, for the 11 and the top, that how can they turn into a self-reinforcing system? Yeah? It is anyway the question for Munich. Anyway, how Munich could develop the startup ecosystem later on to a self-reinforcing. Currently is not. Berlin is more closer to it. The second is not just the size matters. Unfortunately, the location is also matters. We have seen all these west-east and south-north divide in Europe, and because this situation, and because everything follows the long tail power rule, Pareto, whatever you want, rule, that means startup will move away from southern and central and eastern Europe. That is other question: what policies can we use that they will stay there? And they are struggling with scaling, and they are struggling to have access to finance. Now, for us, I think the most important that knowledge is crucially important. So not just the large cities are able to create self-sustaining ecosystem for startups. It is not just a prerequisite for large cities, but also the smaller cities, in particular the university cities. Certainly depends on what kind of university. With world-class university, they can develop the very strong system. And beyond, I think one of the critical point is the upstream stemming or coming from the university students. Yeah? I don't want to ask here the university student who want to create a startups right now. That maybe in the how to use new technologies in the education or so it was, or the big data. But unfortunately, in many, I would say also in Budapest, one of the problems that the upstream is relatively low. However, we discussed that how can we support at the universities. And I would really say that to create a startups is somehow a university student profession. Just incidentally, last week I met a retired Stanford professor who created a startup. So that is a special university cultural zone or something similar, but it is not depending from age. But normally we are waiting for the students that this is the upstream to create new startups. And why we have this west, east, and north, south divide is partly because of this, yeah? That the missing startups, and also within some countries, we can say that just in the brackets anyway, I haven't shown you the figures for Tübingen is higher than in Heidelberg. Yeah, that somehow the student in Tübingen are more involved to establish or create a startups. So how the competition between the different scale-up cities are evolving. As I mentioned, the basic question is how to develop a startup ecosystem, let's say in Budapest or in Warsaw, to achieve that it will be a self-sustaining system. In Budapest, for example, it's always depending on, we have waves when the number of scale-ups and some startup successes are, and then and crisis, and once again, and run again, and run again, that is not so stable and self-sustaining. That is the main question for the southern and central Eastern European cities, while other cities, the main question, how can they develop a self-reinforcing system? Yeah, these are the main policy questions in Europe, and because we today discuss such a things as robots, and we have just a coffee, yeah, that is how I would finish this presentation. So thank you very much.